Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is a lecture for Chapter 3 in our Is Everyone Really Equal text, Sensoy and DiAngelo for EDU 316. So let's get started. This particular chapter will be entitled Culture and Socialization. So let's just jump right in. So if you have your book, you can turn to page 35. And at the top of page 35, you'll see where it says, I don't think about people's race, class, or gender. I just see people as human. That's something I think many of us have all said. And one of the things Sensoy and DiAngelo does is challenges stereotypes or common misconceptions. And I think this is very helpful. And this is the way that they introduce the chapter. And I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along with me here on my slides. This chapter explains the process of socialization and the interplay between our individuality and our membership in social groups, such as race, gender, and class. We also explain how important it is for us to understand that our ideas, views, and opinions are not simply individual, objective, independent. And so a lot of times we may think that our ideas are independent. We're not influenced by anyone or by any structure or institution or organization. But we are all impacted by our surroundings. That's what we should understand in a class like this. Our ideas are not independent, but rather are the result of social messages and conditioning forces. We describe how, the author goes on to say, we describe how in addition to our families, institutions, and other social forces work together to influence our worldview. Examples are provided to illustrate the power of socialization, how it works as an unconscious filter shaping our perceptions. So socialization shapes our perceptions. And as you can see, the title of this chapter is Culture and Socialization. So I'm jumping ahead of myself. I don't think about people's race, class, or gender. I just see people human. And I talked about this. And so I would like to know, you can just reflect upon yourself, reflect with yourself and think about, what are your thoughts on this? Have you found yourself saying this? I have. And so it is very noble. And I understand where we're trying to get at, but it doesn't reflect reality. We do see people's race. When you met me for the first time, you noticed that I was an African-American professor. That's not a bad thing. I think in the United States, we look at this as somehow bad or wrong. But it's not something bad. Sorry about that. You didn't see it was a gnat flying at me, so excuse me. That's why I made that gesture. But at any rate, you will notice a person's color. You notice that I was an African-American professor when you first met me. And it's not like, oh my gosh, we can't let Dr. Charles know that he's an African-American. We don't want him to know that we know. But I'm not ashamed to be a person of color. I'm proud of who I am, just like most people are proud of who they are. Oh, man. So, this chapter explains the process of socialization and interplay between our individuality and our membership. We read this already. We talked about this. Our membership, such as race, ethnicity, gender, and a lot of times, European Americans, people of European descent, do not think of themselves as being from a race. We see whiteness as normal, as the norm. And according to the authors, everything outside of European descent is abnormal. And that's problematic because we're all a part of the human race. And so it sets up an unequal relationship, an unequal viewpoint, whereas European descent is the norm. African, Asian, Hispanic, Indian, or what have you, anything of other ethnicities, Native American, is considered abnormal or not normal. And so when we think about race, we think about those people of color. And people that are white are not used to thinking of themselves as having a race. And so it's a lot to think about. I want you to process that, what I just said. You may have to pause and think about that. Our ideas, views, and opinions are not simply individual or objective. And so I've read this already from the text. What is culture? Culture are the norms, values, practices, patterns of communication, language, laws, customs, and meaning shared by a group of people. In a particular particular location and time period and a place. So you can have Kentucky culture. You can have Northern Kentucky culture. You can have Eastern Kentucky culture. You can have Cincinnati culture. A way of life in a particular region. But it could be extrapolated to be larger, like American culture. What are common values we have in the United States of America? One of the most common languages, not the only, is English. What are our laws that govern us? That has to do with culture. There are many examples of culture that I've given, even like Native American culture or subculture like hip hop, the hip hop movement, or skate culture, skateboarding culture, subculture. Socialization. So we want to think about socialization as different from culture. It refers to our systemic training into norms of our culture. So when we say training, it's not necessarily formal training, but it's the way we come up, the way we are almost indoctrinated and led to look at things a certain way. So if you grew up in Eastern Kentucky, where in a rural area, or parts of Northern Kentucky or Ohio, where it's very rural and is racially homogeneous, not much diversity in terms of black or brown, that's what you're used to. And sometimes we see people of color from a different perspective because all we know is from television or from perception, social media. But even how we talk about education or how we look at jobs or how we look at religion come from a process of socialization. Even gender roles come from socialization. It's a process of learning the meanings and practices that enable us to make sense of and behave appropriately in that culture. What's acceptable in our culture? Like if you're from a rural, sometimes I have students from a rural culture, and there are certain things in a farming town that you don't have to worry about in the city. But there are certain things that we have to worry about in the city, in the urban centers, that is not a concern in a rural setting. And so just think about that as well. And this is one of my favorite illustrations from the text. This is called the iceberg of culture. Often we think about our own culture as the best and as the norm. But this class tries to broaden our view on culture and society and looking at individuals from different perspectives, from our own or even outside of our own perspective. So, in the iceberg of culture, as you can see, that first level, surface culture above sea level, emotional level, relatively low. So, this is generally how we deal with people from different cultures. We see the way they dress, like Mexican culture, mariachis, for example, or Mexican food, or the way they mariachi music. We appreciate that. The arts. My wife is a Spanish educator, in high school Spanish educator. She travels and brings back blankets and artwork and different kinds of artifacts and crafts from Mexico, and it's beautiful. And they have the Mexican dances and literature, language, celebrations, games. So all of these, I was just using Mexico for example. But you can also talk about this as it relates to certain Asian cultures like Chinese, and many times we enjoy Chinese food. But that's surface level. And it doesn't allow us to get deeper and to understand people of various cultures because it makes us uncomfortable if we go too deep. We like to stay in the context of the food and the arts and the sort of accoutrements of culture. But the deep culture goes deeper. It says unspoken rules, partially below sea level, emotional level, very high. So rules of courtesy, contextual, conversational patterns, concept of time. So, for example, in Africa, when I do work in Africa, they're not as strict on time as a Western society. We consider it very rude not to be adherent to time, but that's in an African society and many even some of the South American societies. If they have, for example, an event like I went to church in Africa, and that's what they do all day. So it's not like, so if they do trickle in late, that's okay. We're doing this anyway. This is what we do. They don't try. It's very Western and rationalistic and capitalistic to try to squeeze 6 things into one day. So that's a cultural thing, and we look at it as normal. This is the way to do things. It's wrong if you're really late or. And so rules of conduct, facial expressions, nonverbal communication, body language, touching, eye contact, all these things. Concepts of beauty. So I'm going to use the African example. In Africa, it's very beautiful to have dark skin. But because of the legacy of racism and white supremacy in our country, dark skin has, in some ways, is considered ugly. Okay? Especially a very person, African American, that's looking at my skin tone, that's darker than myself. People see that as not being beautiful. But that's culturally relevant. We have been fed the idea that the blonde European American woman is the highest level of beauty. But that's contingent on culture and where one grows up. So just a thought. Ideas of childbearing, theories on diseases, decision making, who's in leadership? Are males in leadership? There's some societies where there are women elders. So just think about that. Okay, let me move on. I knew I was going to get stuck on that, folks. That's a really important conversation to have. What's below the surface is often easier to see when the deep culture you have been socialized into does not match the deep culture you are currently navigating. So what you may not be used to looking at things a certain way. Like in a farming society, let's use that example again. There are certain times where people harvest. It's harvest season. And everybody in that community understands that. But if you're not from that culture, you're like, why are we stopping school? Why are we getting out of school? Why are we taking a break? Those kinds of things. So in some cases, I've seen people ride horses to school. You might have experienced that. I don't know what part of Kentucky you're from, but very rural. That's very different for myself. I grew up in the city. For example, is there a difference between your culture at home and the culture at your university? What about the way people speak? What about if you're from one of those rural counties where people speak in a very deep Southern accent? You might be from Tennessee, and you come to the north and people use a standard English maybe, but everybody has an accent to someone else. So, but it's not better or worse. That's what we have to realize. Or on your job, do you have to adjust and code switch? We call it code switching. Code switching is when you change your language. You know how to speak the language of corporate America. You know how to speak the language of the restaurant. And then you go back home and you might put your guard down and speak the way that you grew up. That happens a lot in my community. At home, we might speak in African American vernacular, like, "Hey, what's for dinner? Hey, y'all, what's for dinner? Man, this food ain't that good. What's up with this?" You know, we speak very casually, and it's difficult to do it on command. We're like, "Where your mama at?" And it's no reflection on my intelligence. I had 2 doctorate degrees and 2 masters, but it's code switching. But when I come to work or when I'm doing a lecture, I want to be understood. And I want people the standard English is kind of a lingua franca, like a common language we can all understand. And when you go to back home to rural Kentucky, it's the same way. You may not speak the way you speak in college. You understand what I mean? What we might consider abnormal may be normal to somebody else. I'm gonna say that again. What you might consider abnormal may be normal to somebody else. Examples: personal space. When I went to Mexico, people talk to you really close to your face. It's kind of like I'll do it from the profile, and it's very uncomfortable, especially a member of the opposite sex. We consider that violating our personal space and inappropriate. But everybody in that particular culture, they do that, so it's considered normal. Or some cultures, they kiss you on the cheek, or sometimes they give you a big smoocheroo. And for us in the United States, it's like, wow, that's intimate. That's what you do with a girlfriend or boyfriend, or a mom or something. If you're gonna kiss on the cheek like that and linger, or even hugging. So public displays of affection, it's kind of frowned upon and at least on campus. But different styles of dress, going to college, who goes to college, is college frowned upon? All these things are have to do with culture. What is the role? What is our role in relation to groups in which we belong? Are you a leader? Are you in a leadership position? How do you fit in or relate to these groups? Maybe you are the informer. Maybe because you're going off to college, there's the expectation that you have the knowledge. When we say groups, we might refer to your high school basketball team. What's your role on your soccer team, or football, as they say in other parts of the world besides the United States? What was your role in volleyball? Were you the setter? Now, I don't know much about volleyball. I played volleyball, but I don't know all the technical terms. But were you known to be a spiker? What was your role in track? Did you do cross country? What about church? What's your role at church? If you're a religious person, maybe you sang in the choir, maybe you read the scripture sometime, maybe you led youth group, or maybe you were a part of the youth group. So middle classness. A lot of times we don't think of ourselves as having a class, but we certainly do in the United States. Racial or ethnic groups. What's your role in the fraternity? And you can see this on a page. Let's see if my pages correspond, because I used to use an older book. Page 43. Yep, it says you in relation to the groups which you belong. Humans are social beings. This is page 43 towards the bottom. Who depend on humans around us to make sense of our world. A useful metaphor for understanding how we learn to make sense of our world is to think of our culture as a pair of glasses that we wear at all times. Just like the fish is always immersed in the water, we're always wearing our cultural glasses. And we cannot take them off, truly take them off, but we can understand to look at things from a different perspective. There are two significant parts of the glasses, the frames and the lenses. The frames are the big picture, the macro, and what everyone in the culture is taught from birth. The lens constitutes the individual perspective, the micro perspective. Okay, let me move on because I don't want to take too long. Group identity, as you can see here, and various race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, ability, nationality. So you can see, we often think about race, but there's different levels of diversity. The reason why we think about race, because we've always long had a problem with race in this country, even now. With some of the attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion. Some of it stems from our struggle with racial identity and accepting those different from us. But social class, how do we treat our poor? We have a widening gap between the rich and the poor. The legislation seems to be pushing it even further. But if you grew up in a upper class home or a middle class home, and you may not understand how others live. If you always had a car, you've always lived in a house, and you all weren't renters. And by the way, renting does not always determine your social class, especially in places like New York. But if you've always had access to the expectation of you going to college, you've always had money to go get food anytime you want it, then you live somewhat of a privileged life. it's relative, but you do live a pretty privileged life. I'll give you my example. The way I grew up, we rarely got to eat out because it was considered a luxury. Even something as simple as Taco Bell or White Castle or Subway. Subway was considered expensive. We never went to Subway until I was an adult and I had a job. So social class is different. When you're in it, you don't realize that you have privilege. I think that's the challenge. Gender is different from sexuality. Sexuality is biological. Gender is how we're socialized to think girls, for example, go into nursing, girls go into teaching, males go into construction work or the sciences. That's socialization. There's nothing biological about that. The sexuality conversation is biological. Religion, ability, nationality, these are all differences. So there are some questions on page 47. I'm just going to read them, and you can think about your responses. Key careers tend to be organized in ways that are gendered. When we say gendered, that means occupations that we associate with a male or a female. Like I gave the example of nursing. I gave the example of teaching being associated with women. Police and firefighters tend to be men, while teachers and nurses tend to be women. How would the authors explain this pattern? Socialization, okay? According to the authors, why do so many people feel immune to the forces of socialization? Because that's how we're taught. We grow up in it. We consider it the norm. How does the concept of socialization challenge the idea of individualism? So in our society, in the capitalistic U.S. society, we are taught to be individuals and focus on ourselves. And we don't think much about the collective. But in other societies, like even in Mexico, I gave the Mexico example earlier, if one person has a house, everybody lives in that house. That's a collectivist mindset, a communal mindset. You see this in Asian culture as well often. And so there's some benefits to the we. And often you have less homelessness in those societies because when one person has something, everybody has it. And one of my somebody I knew that was in jail gave me a good example. They went to jail with some individuals from Mexico, and when one person had a bag of chips, they split it, and everybody had it instead of a person saying this is mine. So that's a crude example, but I think you get the point. So that's all I want to say about chapter 3. I'll do some more lectures. Like I said, I'm not going to be able to to lecture every time, but this is chapter 3. Hope you got something out of it. I'm sure you did. Let me close out. Na 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 na. Say goodbye. Na 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 na. Say goodbye. So I will see y'all next time. Okay? Keep up with the work. See ya.